He said it on a Tuesday. Not during a fight, not after something I did wrong. Just a Tuesday evening while I was folding laundry and he was scrolling through his phone. He looked up, tilted his head slightly the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing, and said, "Honestly, Lydia, I think I settled. I didn't drop the shirt I was holding. I didn't cry. I just smoothed the fabric over my knee and said, 'What do you mean?' And he shrugged. Actually shrugged. My friends keep asking why I'm still with someone so average. Nathan Chen doesn't do average. I think I've been playing small. Nathan Chen doesn't do average." He said it like that. In third person, about himself. In our bedroom. I set the shirt down on the bed. I looked at him for a long moment, this man I had moved cities for, rearranged my schedule for, funded graduate school for, driven to the emergency room at 2 a.m. twice for, and I said, "Okay, just okay." He blinked. I think he expected tears. Maybe an argument. Maybe me listing everything I'd done for him, pleading my case like a defendant who hadn't prepared well enough. That's what the old version of me would have done. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window for a while watching the street lights turn on. What I didn't tell him was that 3 days earlier, I'd gotten a call from Marcus Webb, my business partner, telling me that Harlow Capital had made a formal offer to acquire 60% of our company. The number they put on the table was $34 million. What I also didn't tell him was that I'd been carrying the weight of our entire life for the past 4 years without him ever once asking where the money came from. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I met Nathan at a conference in Chicago when I was 29. He was charming in the way that certain men are charming, loudly, effortlessly, in a way that makes you feel like the whole room wants to be near him. He had plans. Big ones. He talked about disrupting the logistics industry, about a startup he was building, about how in 5 years he'd be on the cover of something. I was quieter. I'd been building my own thing for 2 years already, a boutique interior design firm I started with Marcus after we both got laid off from the same architecture firm in the same brutal round of cuts. We called it Groundwork Studio. It wasn't glamorous yet. We were doing commercial spaces, small businesses, a few restaurant renovations. Nothing that would impress anyone at a conference cocktail hour. So I didn't mention it much. Nathan talked about his vision and I asked questions and smiled and thought, this is interesting, this person is interesting. We dated for 18 months. He proposed on a rooftop in Nashville. I said yes. Here's what I knew about love at that point. I knew it was something you worked at. I knew it didn't always look like the movies. I knew that two people could want different things and still build something real together if they were patient enough, careful enough, committed enough. Here is what I had not yet learned, that patience has a cost. That making yourself smaller so someone else can feel larger is not a love language. It's a slow erosion. Nathan's startup struggled. The logistics idea never quite got traction. He pivoted twice, brought on investors who pulled out, burned through runway faster than projected. He was stressed all the time, and when he was stressed he became someone I didn't entirely recognize, curt, dismissive, prone to long silences that filled the apartment like weather. During his first rough year, I picked up extra projects. We were living in my condo, I'd bought it before we met, but I told him the mortgage was more than it was, quietly covering the difference myself so he wouldn't feel like a burden. When his salary dropped 30% because he had to defer his own pay to keep the company alive, I adjusted our grocery spending, covered our utilities, renewed his gym membership without mentioning it, replaced his laptop when the old one died. I told myself this was partnership. This was what you did. I told myself that often. While signing checks he didn't know about. While rescheduling client calls around his schedule. While turning down a partnership opportunity in Austin because he didn't want to consider relocating. Meanwhile, Groundwork was growing. Quietly, steadily, the way things grow when you tend them without making a fuss. We landed a contract with a regional hotel chain. Then a national retail brand wanted us for their flagship stores. Marcus brought in a hospitality developer out of Atlanta who became our biggest client and then our biggest advocate. We hired 6 people, then 14, then 23. I didn't hide it from Nathan exactly. But I didn't broadcast it either. He'd ask how work was going and I'd say busy and he'd nod and go back to whatever he was looking at. He never asked for specifics. He never seemed curious. He had a way of talking about his own ventures that filled up every room we were in, and I suppose I'd learned to speak only in the margins he left for me. He knew I ran a design firm. He thought of it as a small business, the way you think of a neighborhood bakery, earnest, modest, probably a passion project more than a career. His friends talked about their compensation packages and their Series B rounds, and Nathan would talk about his plans, and when someone asked what I did, he'd say, "She does interiors," with a slight emphasis on she that meant it's not really the point of this conversation. I let him. That's the part I sit with now. I let him. Groundworks growth hadn't been something I announced at dinner parties. It was something I built in early mornings and late nights, in conversations Nathan wasn't present for, in decisions made in conference rooms while he thought I was at client meetings. By the time Harlow Capital came to us, we had 31 employees, active projects in 9 states, and revenue that would have made Nathan's eyes go wide in a way that had nothing to do with pride. The offer from Harlow came in on a Friday. Marcus called me as I was pulling into our parking garage. $34 million for 60%. Our lawyers needed a week to review the terms. We were looking at closing within 90 days. My cut, after the split and after taxes, somewhere north of $11 million. I sat in the car for 20 minutes before going upstairs. I want to be clear about something. I didn't walk into that apartment on that Friday with some plan forming already. I walked in thinking about how I was going to tell my husband that the thing I'd been building while he looked past me had just become something extraordinary. I thought about whether he'd be proud of me, or whether pride was even part of his emotional vocabulary when it came to me. He was on a call when I came in. He held up one finger without looking at me and kept talking. I made dinner. He finished his call, ate, scrolled through his phone, said the food was good. We watched 40 minutes of television. He went to bed. I sat on the couch alone and thought, when is the last time he asked me how my day was and actually waited for the answer? I couldn't remember. And then 4 days later, Tuesday, laundry, the shrug. I think I settled. I told Marcus the next morning. We were on the phone early, before my first call, and I said, Nathan said something last night that I keep turning over. I told him what Nathan had said. There was a long pause on Marcus's end. What are you going to do? He asked. I don't know yet, I said. But I'm not going to beg. That was the first clear thing I knew. I was not going to beg. Over the next 2 weeks, I did 3 things quietly and without announcement. First, I called our accountant and made sure that every financial record of the past 4 years was organized and documented, every bill I'd covered, every transfer, every account. Not because I planned to wave it in anyone's face. Because I believed in knowing exactly where you stood on your own ground before anyone tried to tell you where you belonged. Second, I met with my attorney, a woman named Denise who'd helped us structure Groundwork's original partnership agreement. I told her where things were with my marriage. She was calm and thorough the way good lawyers are. She walked me through what separate property looked like in our state, what would apply given the timeline of when I'd started the firm, what documentation would matter. She told me I was in a stronger position than I probably realized. I thanked her and went home feeling, for the first time in a while, like the ground under my feet was solid. Third, I stopped. I stopped shrinking. Not dramatically, I didn't announce it and I didn't make a scene. I just started taking up the space I'd been quietly abandoning for 4 years. I stopped rearranging my calls around Nathan's schedule. I stopped answering questions about his startup to his investors when he forgot details. I stopped pre-apologizing for my opinions in our conversations. I stopped saying just a small business thing when someone asked about my work. Nathan noticed something had shifted, but he couldn't name it. He was slightly more attentive for a few days, the way someone is when they feel a draft and can't find where it's coming from. He asked about my week. I answered fully, without editing. He nodded along, but I could tell the scope of what I was describing wasn't landing. In his mind, Groundwork was still the small thing. The interiors thing. The side of the story that wasn't his. The Harlow deal moved faster than expected. Our lawyers finished their review in 4 days instead of 7. There was a request for 1 revision to the earnout structure, which our team handled over a single afternoon call. By the end of week 3, the term sheet was signed. Closing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Marcus sent me a message that night that just said, "It's real. It's really happening." I sat with that for a while. $11 million, 31 people who'd trusted us with their careers. A company built from 2 people who'd been laid off on the same day and decided, quietly and stubbornly, to build something instead of looking for somewhere else to work. I had not settled. Not professionally. Not creatively. Not in any way that actually mattered. I was not average. I had never been average. I had been invisible to someone who wasn't paying attention. There's a difference. The closing happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room downtown. Handshakes, wire confirmations, photos for the Harlow team's internal announcement. I wore a dark green blazer I'd bought specifically for the occasion, and nobody from my personal life knew what was happening that day except Marcus and Denise. Nathan texted me at 2:17 p.m. to ask if I'd remembered to pick up his dry cleaning. I had not. I finished at the conference room by 4. Walked 2 blocks to a coffee shop I liked, ordered an oat milk latte, and sat by the window watching people move past on the street. I thought about calling my mother. I thought about crying. I thought about the version of me from 4 years ago who'd quietly absorbed so many small diminishments and told herself it was love. I called my mother. She cried. I didn't, which surprised me. I felt something quieter than tears, something like the particular relief of standing up straight after being hunched over for a very long time. Are you going to tell him? She asked. Not yet, I said. I want to know who he is first. Before the number changes anything. 2 days later I found out. Nathan came home from dinner with his friends, his actual friends, not mine, the ones who'd apparently been discussing whether I was remarkable enough for their group, and he was in a strange mood. Expansive. The kind of expansive that meant he'd had too much to drink and someone had said something flattering about him. He sat down across from me and said, I've been thinking. Okay, I said. I think we should separate. Not forever necessarily, just I need space to figure out what I actually want. Where I'm actually going. He paused. Devin thinks I'm holding myself back. And I think he might be right. Devin. His friend Devin, who worked in venture capital and had never once, in 3 years, asked me a single question that wasn't surface-level polite. Devin thought Nathan was holding himself back. Because of me. I looked at my husband. I thought about the rent I'd paid while he found himself. The cars. The 1,000 small costs of keeping a life running while someone else focused on their vision. I thought about the Thursday 2 days ago when I'd signed documents that changed my life in a room he didn't know existed. Okay, I said. Okay? Okay. If that's what you want. He blinked. You're not going to fight for this? I don't think fighting is what this needs, I said. And I meant it completely. He left for Devin's place the next morning. He took a bag and his laptop and his favorite jacket, the one I'd bought him for his birthday 3 years ago. He didn't take anything else because he assumed there would be time, I think. He assumed this was a conversation that had more chapters. He assumed a lot of things that were no longer true. Here is what happened next, and I want to be precise about this because the sequence matters. On Monday morning, 10 days after the closing, Harlow Capital issued a press release announcing the acquisition. They included a quote from me, a description of Groundwork's portfolio, a mention of our 31-person team, and the deal value. Their communications person had warned me it would go out that week, but I hadn't known the exact day. I was in a client meeting when Marcus texted, "It's out. PR is live." I finished the meeting. I stepped into the hallway. I pulled up the release on my phone. They'd used a photo of me from a shoot we'd done for a design publication the previous spring, green blazer, direct expression. The kind of photo that makes you look like you know exactly what you're doing. The deal value was listed. My name was in the second paragraph. I put my phone in my pocket and went back to work. What I didn't know yet was that Nathan's friend Devin, the same Devin who thought Nathan was being held back, worked in the same circle as 2 of Harlow Capital's partners. And that Devin had, at some point that Monday afternoon, seen the press release, recognized the name Lydia Wren, and done the kind of quiet math that people in his industry do automatically. Devin called Nathan at 4:45 p.m. I know this because Nathan called me at 4:52. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 5:08. And again at 5:41. The voicemail from the first call was 4 minutes long. His voice was different, not the expansive version from the other night, not the dismissive shrug of a Tuesday in our bedroom. He sounded like someone who had just realized they'd been standing on ice that was much thinner than they thought. He said my name several times. He said I had no idea at least twice. He said he needed to talk to me, that there were things he clearly hadn't understood, that he didn't want to make decisions without the full picture. The full picture. 4 years of the full picture, and now that there was a number attached to it, he wanted to see it. I sat with the voicemail for a long time. I played it again. I tried to locate something inside myself, anger, maybe, or satisfaction, or the urge to call him back and say, see. But what I found instead was something quieter and more definitive. A kind of completion. Like the last page of a book you'd been meaning to finish. I called Marcus instead. Have you seen your phone? He said immediately. I've seen it. Your husband called me. Did you know that? He got my number somehow and he called me and asked me to ask you to call him back. What did you say? I said I'd pass along the message, Marcus said. Then I sat here for 5 minutes trying to figure out how to tell you. Thank you, I said. For all of it. For all of this. There was a pause. You built this, Lydia. Don't let anyone reframe that. I didn't call Nathan that night. Or the next day. On Wednesday, he showed up at the condo. He had a key still. I hadn't changed the locks. Not because I was leaving a door open but because I hadn't wanted to do anything that looked like a reaction. I didn't want any of this to look like a reaction. He came in and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop finishing notes on a project. He looked like he hadn't slept well. He sat down across from me without being invited, which was a habit of his I had never successfully addressed. Why didn't you tell me? He said. I closed my laptop slowly. Tell you what, specifically? Any of it. The company. How big it was getting. The deal. I looked at him for a moment. You never asked. That's not fair. You never asked, I said again, gently, because it wasn't a weapon, it was just the truth. Not once in 4 years did you ask about groundwork in any way that suggested you wanted a real answer. You knew I ran a design firm. You chose what that meant to you. I didn't know. You didn't know because you decided not to know. I kept my voice even. That's different from being kept in the dark. He was quiet for a while. He looked at his hands. I recognized this version of him, the one that appeared when something hadn't gone according to the plan he'd made for himself. I used to rush to fill that silence with reassurance. I didn't anymore. What I said, he started. About settling. About being average. I didn't. You meant it, I said. That's okay. People mean things and then circumstances change and they wish they hadn't meant them. But you meant it when you said it. I was an idiot. Yes, I said. Not unkindly. He looked up at me with something in his eyes that I might have once called hope. So where does that leave us? And here is where I want to be careful. Because what I said next was not about the money. It had nothing to do with the press release or the wire transfer or Devon's phone call or any of the numbers involved. It would have been the same answer on a Tuesday evening 4 years ago if I had been paying closer attention to what was actually happening between us. It leaves us here, I said. You. Someone who looked at the person he married and decided she was ordinary. And me. Someone who spent 4 years making herself smaller because I thought that was what love asked of me. I don't think either of us is the villain. But I don't think we're the right story for each other anymore. He was quiet for a long time. Even now, he said finally. After everything? I understood what even now meant. Even now that I was worth something in the terms he recognized. Even now that the math had rearranged itself into a shape he could see. Even now, I said. Especially now. There's a thing no one tells you about choosing yourself. It doesn't feel triumphant. At least not right away. It feels like standing in a quiet room after something loud has stopped. It feels a little like the first hour after a long flight lands. You're still, finally, but you also have to figure out what you're doing next. I heard through Marcus, a few weeks later, that Nathan's startup had finally folded. That he was consulting now, doing some advisory work for Devon's firm, regrouping. I didn't feel satisfied by this information. I also didn't feel sorry. I just noted it and moved on. Denise handled the divorce with the precision and calm she brings to everything. The financial separation was clean. The condo, which had been mine before the marriage, stayed mine. Groundwork, which I had built independently with no contribution from Nathan in any form, was fully protected. The settlement was straightforward and neither of us contested anything that mattered. I kept the apartment for 6 more months and then sold it and bought a place with a light that came through the east windows in the mornings in a way that made the whole room look like something worth staying in. I still run Groundwork. We took Harlow's capital and expanded into 2 new markets, hired 9 more people, opened a second studio in Seattle. Marcus jokes that we're going to have to stop calling it a boutique firm soon. I tell him boutique is a mindset, not a size. I think about that version of me, sometimes the one folding laundry, smoothing the sheets, absorbing small diminishments, and calling it patience. I don't think she was weak. I think she believed in something and held on longer than was good for her because she didn't want to be someone who gave up. But there's a version of holding on that's really just a failure to pay attention to yourself. A way of pouring so much energy outward that you stop noticing the level dropping inside. I'd been doing that for years without a name for it. I have a name for it now. And I have a practice that goes the other direction. I was at an industry event in New York last fall. The kind of thing I used to navigate in the background while Nathan worked a room. I was there as a panelist. I was introduced by name and by company and by deal, and people in the audience were taking notes. Afterward, a woman came up to me, mid-30s, sharp blazer, the look of someone running on ambition and not enough sleep, and she said, "Can I ask you something personal?" I said yes. She said, "Were you always like this? This confident? Or was there a moment?" I thought about a Tuesday evening. About laundry and a shrug and a man who said he had settled. I thought about the drive home from a conference room after signing documents that changed everything, and how I'd sat in a coffee shop alone and felt relief instead of triumph. There was a moment, I said. But the confidence isn't really what changed. What changed is that I stopped asking permission from people who weren't qualified to grant it. She wrote that down. I hope she uses it. I don't tell this story to make a point about money. I want to be clear about that. The number isn't the vindication. The work is the vindication. The 31 people who trusted us. The hotels and the retail spaces and the restaurants and the hospitals and all the rooms we've changed the light inside of, that's the thing. That was always the thing. Nathan was wrong about me not because I turned out to have a high net worth. He was wrong about me in the way he was wrong about me from the beginning because he looked at a person who was doing something real and decided, without investigation, that she wasn't interesting enough to look at closely. That says nothing about me. It says everything about what he was paying attention to. I know who I am now in a way I didn't 4 years ago. Not louder. Not harder. Just more present in my own life, more willing to take up the space that was always mine. Less interested in managing how I appear to people who've already decided what they see. There is a particular freedom in being underestimated by the right people at the right time. You get to build in the quiet. You get to grow without interference. You get to show up one day as the fullest version of yourself and discover that you don't actually need the people who missed it to validate that it happened. I'm 41 years old. I run a company that I built from nothing, with a person who believed in the same thing I did, in the years when nobody was watching. I have a home that feels like mine. I have mornings that feel like mine. I have a life I stopped waiting for someone else to approve of. On some Tuesday evening not long ago, I was making dinner alone. And I thought about that other Tuesday, the laundry, the shrug, the word average, and I felt something I didn't expect. Grateful. Not for what he said. Not for the carelessness of it or the years of being looked past. But grateful that he said it when he did. That the ceiling he put on me cracked just wide enough that I could finally see through it to what was already on the other side. I had been building something real for a long time. I just had to stop being the last person in the room to know it.